There's a moment near the end of Season 5 of Rick and Morty where a character stands at the edge of everything that's ever been defined, everything that's ever been controlled, and everything that's ever been kept in place by someone else's will, and he just walks through it. No dramatic speech beforehand, no long explanation about why he's doing what he's doing, just a quiet, composed exit from a system that was never built with him in mind. And the music that plays during that moment is one of the most unexpectedly emotional pieces of music the show has ever used. It's called For the Damaged Coda by Blonde Redhead, and if you've seen the scene, you already know exactly the feeling it creates. It's not triumphant, it's not sad, it's something harder to name than either of those things. It feels like relief, like something that was held very tight for a very long time finally being let go. Before we dive in, if you enjoy deep breakdowns like this one, hit subscribe because we've got a lot more of these coming, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's next. That character is Evil Morty, and by the time we get to that scene, by the time we've watched him plan, wait, manipulate, build, and ultimately break through, the question the show is quietly asking isn't whether what he did was evil, the question is whether he had any other choice. But before we can even begin to answer that, we have to understand who Evil Morty is, not just as a villain, not just as a plot device, but as a character who exists within a specific system, responds to that system in a specific way, and ultimately makes a decision that no other character in the entire show is willing to make. And that understanding has to start from the very beginning, because Evil Morty is the kind of character who only makes complete sense when you see everything he's reacting against. So let's start there. Rick and Morty is, on the surface, a science fiction comedy about a genius grandfather and his anxious teenage grandson going on adventures across the universe. And it is that. It really is. The comedy is genuine, the adventures are creative, and the relationship between Rick and Morty at the center of the show is genuinely compelling. But underneath all of that, the show is also about something else. It's about power, about who has it, who doesn't, and what the people who have it are willing to do to keep things exactly the way they are. And no character in the show makes that subtext more visible than Evil Morty. Evil Morty appears in 3 significant moments across the show's run. His first appearance is in Season 1, Episode 10, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. His second major appearance is in Season 3, Episode 7, The Ricklantis Mix-Up. And his defining appearance, the one that ties everything together and gives his entire arc its full weight, is in Season 5, Episode 10, Rickmurai Jack. Each of these appearances builds on what came before, and together they form the most complete character arc in the entire series. Not the funniest, not the most emotionally developed in the traditional sense, but the most complete in terms of having a beginning, a middle, and an end that all connect to a single coherent idea. And that idea is this: the world that Rick built is not a world that works for Morty, not for any Morty, and the only way out of it is to break it entirely. Now, Evil Morty is unusual in the context of Rick and Morty for a number of reasons, but the most important one is probably the simplest. He's a Morty who thinks for himself. That sounds almost too basic to be interesting, but within the world of the show, within the specific logic of how Ricks and Mortys function together, it's actually a radical act, because in the universe of Rick and Morty, Mortys are not really expected to think for themselves. They're expected to follow. They're expected to be confused, to be scared, to be reactive, to be managed. They're expected to be exactly what they are: anxious, well-meaning, slightly hapless kids who go along with whatever their Rick has planned. And in most cases, they do exactly that. Evil Morty doesn't, and the show never explains in any clean, explicit way how or why he became different. There's no scene where we watch him snap. There's no flashback to the moment he decided to stop being a regular Morty. What the show gives us instead is the result of whatever that transformation was: a Morty who looks at the system he's been placed inside and doesn't accept it. A Morty who is patient enough to plan, intelligent enough to execute, and determined enough to see it through to the end, regardless of what that end requires. What makes him stand out among every other character in the show, not just among Mortys, but among all characters, is that he is the only one who identifies the actual problem and acts on it. Rick sees the problem, but is too emotionally invested in his own position within the system to dismantle it. Morty, the main Morty we follow throughout the show, suspects something is wrong, but is too attached to Rick to fully confront it. The other Ricks and Mortys of the Citadel are too consumed with survival within the system to imagine anything beyond it. Evil Morty is the only one who looks at the full picture, decides it's unacceptable, and does something about it. That doesn't make him a hero. The show is very careful never to frame him as one. The things he does are genuinely harmful. People die because of his actions. Systems are destroyed. But the show is also careful not to frame him as simply a villain, which is the more interesting choice, because a pure villain is easy to dismiss. A villain who is responding to real, documented injustice, a villain whose grievances you can actually trace through the narrative, is much harder to dismiss. And Evil Morty's grievances, when you trace them through what the show actually shows us, are very real. He's not angry at Rick because he lost some personal battle. He's not trying to take over some corner of the universe for his own benefit. What he's trying to do, and what he eventually succeeds in doing, is leave. He just wants out of the system, out of the hierarchy, out of the carefully maintained portion of reality that Rick has constructed to keep himself at the top. He wants to exist somewhere that Rick's logic doesn't apply, somewhere that was never organized around the question of what Rick wants. And when you think about it that way, it stops feeling like villainy. It starts feeling like something much more basic. It starts feeling like someone who was placed inside a cage that everyone else accepts as normal, looked at the bars, understood what they were, and decided to find a door. The story of Evil Morty is the story of that door, how he found it, how he built the key, and what it cost him to walk through it. And to tell that story properly, you can't start with Evil Morty himself. You have to start with the world he was trying to escape. So let's talk about the Citadel. Let's talk about what it is, how it works, who it was built for, and what it does to the people who live inside it. Because the Citadel is the context for everything Evil Morty does. It's the environment that shaped him, the institution he eventually took over, and the machine he ultimately destroyed. You can't understand why he did any of it without first understanding what the Citadel is and what it represents. But before we even get there, let's sit with the character himself for just a moment longer, because one of the most interesting things about Evil Morty, one of the things the show does that's so deliberate it's almost easy to miss, is that we almost never hear him speak at length. He is not the kind of character who monologues. He doesn't explain himself unless he has to. He doesn't try to convince people of his perspective unless it serves a strategic purpose. He is economical with his words in the same way that Rick is economical with his emotions. He says what needs to be said, and then he acts. And that restraint is itself a kind of characterization. It tells you that this is not someone who needs validation. This is not someone who's performing for an audience. This is someone who has a plan and is executing it, and the rest of the world's understanding of his motivations is simply not a priority. That quality, that absence of performance, is part of what makes him so distinctive. Almost every other character in the show is, at some level, performing. Rick performs cynicism. Morty performs goodness. The Ricks of the Citadel perform authority. Evil Morty just exists and acts and watches and waits, and when the time is right, he moves. There's also something worth noting about the visual language the show uses when Evil Morty appears. When he first appears, he's wearing an eye patch over his left eye, which immediately signals that he's different. The eye patch is a practical story element, as we'll discuss in detail when we get to his first appearance, but it's also a visual shorthand. It marks him as different, not just in terms of his intentions, but in terms of his experience. He has been through something that left a mark, and that mark is physical enough to be visible on his face. By the time he appears in season 3, the eye patch is gone. He's clean-cut, calm, presentable. He's running for office. He's shaking hands. He's giving speeches. He's playing a role, strategically and brilliantly. And the fact that he can do that he can fold himself into the expectations of the system well enough to get elected by that system, is another dimension of his intelligence that the show respects without celebrating. And by season 5, when we see him fully, when we understand his origin and watch him execute his final plan, all the layers come together. The boy who was used, the strategist who took control, and the person who simply wanted to be free. It's not a redemption arc. It's not a villain's descent. It's something that doesn't fit neatly into either category. And that's exactly why it's worth spending this much time on. Rick and Morty is a show full of characters who are, in one way or another, stuck. Stuck in cycles of behavior, stuck in relationships, stuck in systems they understand but can't escape. Evil Morty is the only character in the entire run of the show who actually escapes. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. He breaks the system, steps outside of it, and disappears into a version of reality that the rest of the show can't even access. And that's what we're going to spend the next several hours exploring together. We're going to go through his story from the beginning. beginning. We're going to look at the world he was born into, the institution that defined the terms of his existence, the relationship at the center of that institution, and the specific choices he made at each moment his story touches the show's narrative. We're going to be careful. We're going to stick to what the show actually tells us, what it actually shows us, and what the characters actually say. Not fan theories, not speculation, just the show itself, examined carefully and thoughtfully. Because the show, when you examine it that way, makes a pretty compelling argument. Not that Evil Morty was a good person, not that everything he did was justified, but that the thing he was fighting against, the thing he ultimately destroyed and escaped, was real. It was a real system of control, built by real choices, maintained by real power, and it was doing real harm to real people. And the show wants you to see that. Whether Evil Morty was right is the question this video is named after, but the more honest version of that question isn't about whether he was right, it's about whether the system he escaped was wrong. Because if the system was wrong, then the act of escaping it stops looking like villainy and starts looking like something else entirely. Let's find out. Section 2. Life inside the Citadel. The Citadel of Ricks is one of the most interesting settings in the entire show, and it's interesting for a reason that's easy to overlook if you're moving too fast through the episodes. The Citadel is not just a cool sci-fi location, it's not just a backdrop for zany interdimensional politics, it's a mirror. It's Rick and Morty holding up a mirror to ideas about society, class, labor, and institutional power, and then populating that mirror with versions of the two main characters. Every Rick on the Citadel is Rick, every Morty on the Citadel is Morty, and the society that forms around them, the hierarchies and economies and power structures that emerge from that population, it's all a direct reflection of what those characters are, what they value, and what they're willing to do to each other. That's a strange thing to think about. The Citadel is a society entirely composed of variants of two people, and the fact that those two people, when multiplied across thousands of individuals, naturally form an unequal, stratified, often exploitative social structure, that's not an accident. The show is making a point about the nature of the characters themselves. What Rick is, in aggregate and at scale, tends toward dominance. What Morty is, in aggregate and at scale, tends toward subjugation. Not because that's their fate, not because there's anything inherently wrong with either of them, but because that's what the system they live in does to them. It reinforces and amplifies the existing power differential until it becomes an entire society organized around one simple truth. Ricks are in charge and Mortys do what they're told. The show first introduces the Citadel of Ricks in Season 1, Episode 10, Quote 4, which is the same episode where Evil Morty first appears. And in that episode, the Citadel is shown primarily from the perspective of Rick C137, the main Rick, the one we follow throughout the series, who has been summoned before the Council of Ricks to answer for a series of murders he allegedly committed. The Council is a governing body of Ricks. It's composed entirely of Ricks. There are no Mortys on the Council. The Mortys who are present in the Citadel scenes in that episode are in the background, in hallways, doing tasks, waiting. They are, to the Citadel's leadership, background characters in their own place of residence. This is important. The Citadel is established from the very beginning as a place where the lines of power are clear and where Mortys exist at the margins of the institution's actual decision-making. The Council of Ricks governs. The Mortys exist within the governed space. That's the basic structure, and while the show doesn't fully develop the inner workings of the Citadel until Season 3, that first glimpse tells you everything you need to know about the fundamental logic of the place. Season 3, Episode 7, The Ricklantis Mix-Up, is where the Citadel gets its fullest treatment. The episode is structured as an anthology. Several separate storylines, all set on a rebuilt Citadel following the events of Season 3's premiere, which had seen Rick destroy the Citadel as part of his escape from imprisonment. The Citadel, after that destruction, has been rebuilt, and the society that has reconstituted itself within it is shown in considerable detail across several different social strata. What we see is a society with clear class divisions. There are wealthy Ricks who live in nice parts of the Citadel, who dress well and live comfortably, and look down on the Ricks and Mortys who work in the factories and patrol the streets. There are factory Mortys who do repetitive, unpleasant, low-skilled labor for what is implied to be minimal compensation. There are cop Ricks and cop Mortys, though the partnership between them is not a partnership of equals, as the episode makes clear pretty quickly. There are Mortys who have carved out slightly more individualistic existences, geniuses who have developed their own personalities and styles and perspectives, and who exist slightly outside the norm, but only slightly and not without cost. The quote, "six-wafer cookie factory" is one of the episode's key settings. The Ricks who work there are not running the factory. They are the product. The factory harvests the neurochemical experiences of Ricks who are kept in pods, living out looping memories of moments of genuine happiness with their Mortys, and those neurochemicals are used to flavor a commercial product. Simple Ricks, the brand, is built on the idea that Rick, in his simplest, most human moments, the moments when he's just a grandfather, not a genius, not a cynical interdimensional wanderer, just a guy who loves his granddaughter and finds peace in that, is a commodity. His happiness is literally farmed and sold. That detail is not played for pure horror, but it is genuinely horrifying if you think about it for more than a few seconds. The Citadel, which is ostensibly an institution built by and for Ricks, has found a way to commodify even the most private emotional experiences of its own population. And the Ricks who do the harvesting are themselves workers in a system that benefits someone else. The wealth flows somewhere. The product is sold to someone. The factory exists in service of a profit motive that isn't clearly serving the workers inside it. Now extend that logic to the Mortys. The factory Mortys in that episode work on an assembly line. They're interchangeable. They do their work, they go home, they come back and do it again. They have no particular agency within the work itself. They're not making decisions. They're not building skills that transfer to other parts of their lives. They're just working. And the work is defined for them by a system they didn't design and don't control. One of the storylines in the episode follows a Morty who works in this factory and decides to run for president, which we'll discuss in much more detail in the section on Evil Morty's election. But even in the non-Evil Morty storylines, the episode is doing important work in showing us what the texture of life in the Citadel looks like for the people at the bottom of its hierarchy, and it doesn't look particularly good. The Cop Rick and Cop Morty storyline is especially illuminating. These are two figures of institutional authority. They're literally law enforcement, but even within that context, the relationship between them is unequal. The Rick is the senior partner. He makes the calls. He takes the credit. He has the authority. The Morty is the junior partner. He's there to follow, to assist, to be managed. And the Morty in this storyline eventually confronts the Rick about what he sees as corruption, about what he's watching their institution do and ignore and facilitate. And the way that confrontation ends, with the Morty being shot by the Rick and the killing covered up, is one of the episode's darkest moments. It shows that even within the Citadel's institutional structures, the violence against Mortys is not an aberration. It's a feature. It's something the system allows because it's something the system needs in order to maintain itself. The Citadel also has a specific economy around the use of Mortys that deserves some attention. The show establishes, both in this episode and in the broader context of the series, that Mortys serve a practical function for Ricks beyond just companionship or family obligation. Morty's brainwaves are, in some neurological sense that the show describes but doesn't fully explain, a kind of camouflage for Rick's intelligent signature. Rick's genius-level brain activity is apparently detectable to various entities across the universe, enemies, governments, other institutions that might want to track or target Rick. In Morty's less mathematically organized, more emotionally reactive brainwaves, when in close proximity to Rick, create a kind of interference pattern that makes Rick's signature harder to detect. The show uses the phrase underscore underscore quote underscore 8 underscore underscore at various points to describe this. What this means, functionally, is that Morty is not just Rick's companion. Morty is also Rick's camouflage. Morty's very presence protects Rick in a way that Morty doesn't choose and doesn't fully understand. He's being used as a tool, and not just in the specific adventures they go on together. His neurological existence is itself a resource that Rick benefits from. And in the Citadel, where there are thousands of Mortys and thousands of Ricks, this dynamic is scaled up into an institutional reality. Mortys are not just companions, they are a resource. They are part of the infrastructure. This is a genuinely uncomfortable idea, and the show doesn't try to soften it too much. It's presented as a fact of the world, one that the Ricks in power have built their entire institution around, and one that the Mortys within the institution rarely have the opportunity or the awareness to fully confront. Most Mortys don't know the full extent of what they represent within the system. They experience the day-to-day reality of their lives, the factory work, the patrol duties, the adventures with their Ricks, without necessarily understanding the structural logic that makes all of it possible. The school for Mortys that appears in the Citadel is another detail worth noting. There's a Morty school shown in the episode set on the Citadel, which might seem at first like a positive thing. The institution is educating its young population, it's investing in development, but look at what that school is doing and what it's teaching. The curriculum, as far as the show reveals it, is not designed to produce independent critical thinkers. It's designed to produce compliant, functional Mortys who know their role within the system. The things Mortys learn in the Citadel's educational context are things that make them useful within the Citadel's existing structure. The school is not liberatory. It's preparatory, preparing Mortys for the place the system has already decided they should occupy. There's also the matter of the Morty district, or the part of the Citadel that Mortys primarily inhabit, which the show depicts as noticeably less maintained, less wealthy, and less resourced than the parts of the Citadel where the more prosperous Ricks live. This isn't an accident of aesthetic, it's a reflection of resource allocation. The Citadel, like any real institution, distributes its resources unequally, and the unequal distribution falls predictably along the Rick-Morty divide. Ricks tend to end up with more, Mortys tend to end up with less. And the gap between those two outcomes is not just a statistical accident, it's the result of a system that was designed, whether consciously or not, to produce exactly that result. What's striking about all of this, when you step back and look at the full picture of what the Citadel is and how it functions, is how ordinary it is. It's not a prison. It's not a torture chamber. It's not an explicitly oppressive state in the most overt sense. It's a society. It has schools and factories and police and elections and commercial products and neighborhoods. It has the full apparatus of a normal institutional life. And that normalcy is exactly what makes it work. Because when a system of inequality is embedded in the ordinary structures of daily life, when it's just how the school works and how the police work and how the economy works, it becomes very difficult to see it as a system at all. It just looks like reality. It looks like the way things are. That's the most insidious quality of the Citadel's power structure, not its explicit violence, though that exists, as the Cop Rick and Cop Morty storyline shows, but its ordinariness, its ability to present itself as just the natural order of things, the logical outcome of how Ricks and Mortys simply are. The system doesn't need to constantly remind people that it's in charge. The schools do that, the factory jobs do that, the pay scales and the neighborhood divisions and the political structures that keep Ricks in positions of actual power while offering Mortys a small degree of representational inclusion. They all do that. The system reproduces itself through the everyday texture of life inside it, and most people inside it never have the distance from it to see it clearly. Evil Morty has that distance. That's what makes him different. That's what makes him dangerous to the system, and that's what makes his story worth telling. But we also need to understand, before we go further, that the Citadel didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from the specific dynamic between Ricks and Mortys, from what that relationship actually is, what it actually does, and what happens when you scale it from two individuals to a whole society. Because the Citadel is, in a very real sense, just the Rick-Morty relationship writ large. Every inequality in the Citadel is a structural echo of something in that foundational relationship. To understand the Citadel fully, you have to understand what Ricks and Mortys are to each other and what that relationship costs. That's where we're going next. Section 3. The relationship between Ricks and Mortys. The relationship between Rick and Morty is the beating heart of the show. It's the thing the show returns to again and again. The thing it interrogates and tests and complicates across every season. And in many ways, it's a genuinely loving relationship. Rick, despite everything, cares about Morty. Morty, despite everything, loves Rick. The show has established that clearly enough that you'd have to willfully ignore a lot of evidence to argue otherwise. There are moments of real tenderness between them, real sacrifice, real affection that cuts through all the cynicism and chaos of their lives together. But loving someone and treating them well are not always the same thing. And the show is very honest in its particular way about the ways in which Rick's love for Morty coexists with habits and patterns of behavior that are genuinely harmful to Morty. Not out of malice mostly, not because Rick doesn't care, but because of something more complicated and harder to address, a combination of Rick's specific psychology, his entrenched assumptions about his own superiority, and the structural logic of the dynamic itself. Let's start with something the show establishes very early: the power imbalance. Rick is a near omnipotent genius with a portal gun, a spacecraft, and resources that stretch across the entire universe. Morty is a 14-year-old boy with no special abilities, limited knowledge of the universe they're moving through, and a level of emotional development that's still very much in progress. Those two people are not starting from an equal position. They never have been. And while that imbalance can be navigated with care, while it's possible for Rick to be mindful of how much more he has and how much that affects the terms of their relationship, that's not consistently what happens. What consistently happens is that Rick makes the plans. Rick decides where they're going, Rick determines what the mission is and what risks are acceptable, and Morty participates in those decisions primarily by going along with them or occasionally complaining before being overruled. Morty's input matters to Rick emotionally. Rick does genuinely respond to Morty's feelings, does sometimes change course because of Morty's distress or objections, but Morty's input matters far less in any structural or logistical sense. Morty doesn't decide the destination. Morty doesn't decide the mission. Morty is there, and his presence is valued, but the terms of his presence are set by someone else. This is the basic template of the relationship, and it's the template that the Citadel scales up into a whole society. Every Rick in the Citadel has a Morty. Every Morty is, to some degree, in the same structural position as the Morty in the main storyline. Present, valued to varying degrees, but operating within a frame of reference set by Rick. The relationship is not a collaboration. It's not a partnership of equals. It's a relationship between someone with enormous power and someone with very little. And the one with the power tends, over time, to shape the relationship around their own needs and priorities. Now, in the main storyline, that tendency is complicated by Rick's genuine love for Morty, and by Morty's genuine agency within the emotional core of the relationship. But in the Citadel, at scale, those complications get ironed out. At the institutional level, the relationship between Ricks and Mortys doesn't have the particular, specific softening that personal affection provides. At the institutional level, what remains is the structural logic. And the structural logic, when you strip away the individual affection, is Ricks use Mortys. The show is explicit about this. It's been explained directly across several episodes that Ricks keep Mortys for practical reasons, not just sentimental ones. The neurological camouflage function that Morty's brainwaves provide, what the show calls the __quote_9__ in various ways, is a genuine tactical asset for Rick. Having a Morty around makes Rick harder to track, harder to find, and therefore safer. This isn't Rick's primary reason for caring about Morty in the main storyline, but it's part of the broader context of why Ricks and Mortys exist together as a pattern across the multiverse. The relationship has a utility to it that doesn't disappear just because it also has an emotional dimension. And when you're one of the Ricks on the Citadel, operating within an institution where the utility of Mortys is baked into the structure of everything, that utility becomes the dominant frame. The emotional dimension of the relationship is still present for many Ricks. The show makes clear that not all Ricks are equally indifferent or cynical about their Mortys, but the institutional context is always there, shaping how that relationship gets expressed and what limits get placed on it. Think about what it means to be a Morty in the Citadel's labor structure. You have a Rick. That Rick has work to do, missions to run, a life to maintain within the economic and social structure of the Citadel, and your presence in that life serves functions that Rick values: the camouflage, the companionship, the specific ways you make Rick's existence safer and more tolerable. But you don't get to decide what role you play. You don't get to negotiate the terms. The relationship was established before you had enough information to understand what you were agreeing to, and the system that governs your life isn't designed to give you a venue for renegotiating it later. Some Ricks are better than others in this regard. Some Ricks genuinely treat their Mortys with care and consideration, manage the power differential responsibly, and build relationships that feel more genuinely mutual despite the structural inequity. The show acknowledges this. Not all Ricks are equally bad, and the show doesn't treat them as a monolith of indifference, but the institution as a whole is not organized around the best case expression of the Rick-Morty relationship. It's organized around the baseline function of that relationship, which means it's organized around what Ricks need and what Mortys provide. One of the things the show does most effectively in its treatment of this dynamic is show how it affects Morty's sense of himself. Over the course of the series, we watch Morty develop, gain confidence, gain knowledge, gain a kind of hard-won emotional sophistication that comes from going through what he's been through. But we also watch Morty struggle consistently with questions of his his own worth and identity that are directly connected to being Rick's Morty. He measures himself against Rick and finds himself lacking. He defines his own value partly in terms of what he is to Rick, what he contributes to Rick, what Rick thinks of him, whether Rick respects him. And while that's a normal feature of close relationships, it's amplified by the structural fact that Rick really does have all the power in the relationship. Rick's opinion of Morty doesn't just matter emotionally, it has real effects on Morty's life. That dynamic, the way the powerful person's perception of the less powerful person shapes the less powerful person's perception of themselves, is one of the most consistent and realistic things the show does. Morty hasn't been broken by it, he hasn't been destroyed, he's still a functional, caring, mostly decent person trying to navigate an extremely unusual life. But the imprint of that dynamic is visible in him, in his anxieties and his insecurities, and his occasional explosive frustration when the imbalance becomes too visible to ignore. Now scale that up to thousands of Mortys in the Citadel. Each one is in some version of that dynamic. Each one is carrying some version of that imprint. Each one is living a life whose terms were set by someone with more power in a system that doesn't give them meaningful tools to question or change those terms. And the institution around them, the schools, the jobs, the neighborhoods, the police, all reinforces the same basic message. This is how things are, this is what you are, this is the role you fill, and the expectation is that you will fill it. The show doesn't present this as purely the result of malice. The Ricks of the Citadel are not, for the most part, mustache-twirling villains who are consciously oppressing Mortys for fun. They're doing what the system rewards them for doing, what the system teaches them to do, what the logic of their own position in the hierarchy tells them is normal and acceptable. That's actually the more interesting critique. Not that individual Ricks are evil, but that a system built on the logic of Rick's supremacy will tend, over time, to produce outcomes that are harmful to Mortys, not because anyone necessarily intended that, but because the system's design makes it the natural result. There's something else worth examining here, which is the question of how this dynamic affects Rick, not Morty, but Rick, because the Rick-Morty relationship is not only harmful to Morty, it's harmful to Rick in ways the show explores with considerable subtlety. Rick, as a character, is someone who is deeply afraid of genuine vulnerability, genuine emotional dependency, genuine love that doesn't have an escape route, and the structure of the relationship, as he has established it, protects him from fully confronting those things. He can care about Morty, and he does, but he can always retreat behind the logic of, I'm the one running this, I'm the one who knows what's happening, I'm the one in control, whenever the emotional stakes get too high. The structural imbalance he's built into the relationship gives him an out from the scarier aspects of real intimacy. This is most visible in the moments when Morty pushes back most directly, when Morty demands to be heard, to be taken seriously, to be treated as a person rather than a companion or a ward. In those moments, Rick often retreats, he minimizes, he deflects, he uses his own intelligence and wit to reframe the conversation until the discomfort dissipates. He rarely, fully meets Morty at the level of emotional honesty that those moments are calling for. And that pattern, that consistent refusal to fully relinquish the protective cover of his own authority, is both a character flaw and a structural consequence. The relationship he's built gives him permission to do that. The system, in other words, isn't just harmful to Morty, it also prevents Rick from being his best self. But of course, Rick doesn't feel the harm the way Morty does. Rick's experience of the relationship is mostly positive, because the relationship is organized around what Rick needs. Rick travels the universe, makes the decisions, pursues his interests, and has a companion who provides cover and company and genuine emotional sustenance. The costs of the relationship fall primarily on the one with less power. That's how it tends to work. Understanding this dynamic at the level of two individuals is necessary groundwork. But to understand Evil Morty, you need to understand what this dynamic looks like not just between two people, but as the organizing principle of an entire society. Because the Citadel is what you get when you take the logic of the Rick-Morty relationship and build a civilization out of it. And that civilization, as the show reveals it, is not a good place for Mortys. The Mortys of the Citadel are not all in the same situation as Morty in the main storyline. Their specific relationships with their Ricks vary enormously, but they all live within the same institutional logic, a logic that was built to serve Ricks, that distributes power and resources in ways that benefit Ricks, and that reproduces itself through the everyday structures of Citadel life. And within that system, the freedom available to any individual Morty is tightly constrained, not by chains, not by walls, but by the much more effective constraint of a world in which the alternatives to compliance simply aren't visible. That's the illusion of freedom that the system creates, and it's the next thing we need to talk about. Section 4, the illusion of freedom. Here's something worth thinking about carefully. What does freedom actually mean for a Morty on the Citadel? On the surface, Mortys in the Citadel have certain freedoms. They can move around, they can socialize, they can hold jobs in a limited range of available positions. They can, as the Season 3 election episode demonstrates, even participate in democratic politics to a degree. There are Morty candidates in the election, and Mortys can vote. They are not literally imprisoned, they are not held in cells. The Citadel does not present itself as a prison, and in the most literal sense, it isn't one. But freedom is a more complex concept than just the absence of chains. Real freedom requires not just the absence of explicit constraint, but the presence of meaningful alternatives. It requires that when you make a choice, you're choosing from options that are actually available to you, that reflect what you actually want, and that aren't so thoroughly shaped by forces outside your control that your __quote_11__ is more accurately described as a managed response to a predetermined environment. By that standard, the freedom available to Mortys in the Citadel is heavily compromised. Not eliminated, the show doesn't present the Citadel as a totalitarian state in the crude sense, but heavily compromised. Compromised by the limited range of roles available to them, by the educational system that prepares them only for those roles, by the resource distribution that makes certain paths affordable and others essentially impossible, and by the social and psychological environment of a world where the dominant message about what Mortys are and what they're for is everywhere and constant. Let's talk about the educational dimension first, because it's the one that starts earliest. The Morty School on the Citadel is where young Mortys learn what they are, not explicitly necessarily. No teacher stands up and says __quote_12__, but the implicit message of an educational system is communicated through what it teaches, what it rewards, what it considers success, and what kinds of futures it prepares students for. And the Morty School on the Citadel prepares students for lives within the Citadel's existing economic and social structure. The curriculum is calibrated to the available roles. The definition of achievement is defined in terms of what the system values. Children who go through that system emerge from it with a set of competencies that are useful within the Citadel's existing structure, and a set of expectations about what their lives will look like that match what the Citadel has available for them. Not because they were explicitly indoctrinated, but because that's what education in a stratified system does. It produces people who fit the system because it was designed by the system for the system. The freedom of the graduate is real in a narrow sense. They can choose between the available options, but the available options have already been significantly narrowed by the time they graduate. This is not unique to the Citadel, of course. It's a pattern recognizable in many real-world institutional contexts, but the show dramatizes it particularly clearly because of the specific nature of the population. All these Mortys are variants of the same person. They have the same baseline temperament, the same intellectual capacity, the same emotional architecture, and yet the Citadel produces radically different outcomes for different Mortys based entirely on where they fall in the social and economic structure. Some Mortys end up in comfortable, manageable lives. Others end up in factories, or in poverty, or in situations of significant vulnerability. The variation isn't explained by individual difference because the individuals are all versions of the same starting point. The variation is explained by the system, by what the system offers to different people and what it expects from them. The factory Mortys in the Season 3 episode are a particular focus of this. They're doing repetitive industrial labor day after day in exchange for what is implied to be a wage that keeps them functional but not comfortable. They have no particular power in their relationship with their employer. They can't negotiate meaningfully because the alternative to accepting the job is unclear and potentially worse. They go to work because going to work is what you do, because the system has arranged itself so that the practical option is to participate in it rather than to resist it. Not because anyone is holding a gun to their heads. The coercion is more diffuse than that, but because the system has made everything outside its own structure so inaccessible that participation feels like the only realistic choice. Now, within this constrained environment, some Mortys do find ways to assert individuality and push back against the expected role. The show is careful not to present all Mortys as passive and compliant. There are Mortys in the Citadel who have developed distinct personalities, who have pushed beyond the baseline expectation, who have found ways to create meaning and community and small zones of genuine self-determination within the larger constraints of the system. The rebellious Mortys, who dye their hair and dress differently and hang out in their own district, are an example of this. They've carved out a cultural identity that distinguishes them from the standard Morty template. But even that individuality exists within limits set by the system. The rebellious aesthetic doesn't actually change the material conditions of their lives. The dyed hair and distinctive fashion don't translate into greater political power, better economic opportunity, or a genuine alternative to the roles the Citadel has designated for Mortys. The system can accommodate a certain degree of subcultural distinction, can absorb it and make room for it without its fundamental structure being challenged. The Mortys who look different are still working the same jobs, still living in the same neighborhoods, still subject to the same institutional logic that governs all Mortys. The appearance of nonconformity coexists with the reality of conformity to the system's deeper demands. This is one of the most subtle and effective things the show does in its depiction of Citadel society. It shows a system that is sophisticated enough to allow for surface-level variation. Enough variation that it doesn't feel purely oppressive, enough that individuals can identify personally distinct identities within it while maintaining the fundamental structure of inequality and control. The system doesn't crush every expression of Morty individuality. It just ensures that those expressions don't translate into structural change. You can be a Morty who looks different, you just can't be a Morty who runs the Citadel. Or at least, that's how the system is supposed to work. And it does work that way, right up until Evil Morty. The political dimension of this illusion of freedom is particularly interesting. The Season 3 election is set up as a genuinely competitive democratic process. There are multiple candidates, there are debates, there are campaign speeches and voting, and all the apparent machinery of democratic choice. And Mortys are allowed to vote. The episode makes a point of showing Morty voters, Mortys who feel genuinely invested in the outcome, who believe their vote matters, who respond emotionally to the candidates' speeches. But look at the actual options available to those voters. The election, prior to Evil Morty's campaign, is a race between Rick candidates. All of the serious, establishment, well-resourced candidates for the presidency of the Citadel are Ricks. The inclusion of Morty voters in the democratic process is a feature of the system that doesn't meaningfully threaten the system's power structure, because the realistic outcome of the election, without a disruptive Morty candidate, is that a Rick gets elected. The Mortys get to participate in choosing which Rick runs things. That's their democratic power. It's inclusion in the process without inclusion in the outcome. And even when a Morty candidate does emerge, when Evil Morty, running as quote 14, enters the race, the establishment's response is revealing. The Rick candidates and the institutions they represent are immediately hostile to the idea of a Morty in the race. Not because they've assessed his policies and found them lacking, not because they have genuine political objections to what he's proposing, but because a Morty in a position of real power is outside the logic of the system, and the system's instinct is to push back against it. The Morty candidate is treated as inherently suspect, inherently transgressive, inherently a problem to be managed rather than a voice to be engaged with. Which brings us to something important about the nature of this illusion of freedom. The system isn't static, it responds. When the edges of the system are tested, when someone tries to do something the system didn't anticipate and doesn't want, the system adjusts. It uses whatever tools are available to it to maintain its fundamental structure. In the Citadel's case, those tools include the full force of its political and economic establishment, its media, its law enforcement, and ultimately, its willingness to use direct violence when softer methods fail. The system, in other words, is not just a set of passive structures, it's actively self-reinforcing. It doesn't wait to be challenged before it acts. It shapes the environment so that challenges are less likely to arise. And when they do arise, it has mechanisms ready to manage them. The freedom within the system exists at the system's permission. And when someone starts to exercise a freedom that the system hasn't permitted, when someone starts to do something that could actually change the fundamental power dynamics, the permission is revoked. For a Morty living in this environment, the psychological effect of all of this is significant. When the system is working as designed, the message a Morty receives is consistent and clear. This is the world, these are your options, this is what you are and what you can expect. The message is delivered so consistently and through so many different channels: school, work, neighborhood, neighborhood, police, media, culture, that it begins to feel not like a message, but like reality. Like the way things simply are, rather than the way the system has decided to arrange them. The difference between those two things, between the way things are and the way a system has arranged them, is extremely important. Because if you believe the former, you have no reason to resist. Resistance makes no sense if the thing you're resisting is just reality. But if you understand the latter, if you can see that the arrangements you're living within are choices that were made by specific people with specific interests in ways that benefit some more than others, then resistance becomes at least thinkable. The cage becomes visible. Most Mortys never achieve that visibility. The system is designed to prevent it, but Evil Morty did. Somehow, through some combination of experience and intelligence and whatever particular quality separates him from all the other Mortys who went through the same world and came out accepting it, he achieved it. He saw the cage. And once you've seen the cage, the question becomes not whether to accept it, but how to open it. Understanding why Evil Morty was able to see what other Mortys couldn't requires going back to the very beginning of his story. It requires going back to Season 1, Episode 10, and examining carefully what we're actually shown about who he is, where he came from, and what happened to him. Because his first appearance is not just a plot revelation, it's a window into the specific experience that created this particular kind of Morty. Let's go back to that beginning. Section 5, Evil Morty's first appearance. Season 1, Episode 10 of Rick and Morty is called quote_15_. It's a title that works on two levels. It's a play on the Spielberg film title __quote_16_, and it's a description of what the episode is actually about. Rick encountering other versions of himself in a way that tests the assumptions he makes about identity, loyalty, and who the real enemy actually is. The episode begins with a series of deaths. Ricks across the multiverse are being murdered, and in each case, the murder has Rick C137's, our Rick's, portal signature on it. The implication is that our Rick has been on a killing spree. Our Rick is summoned before the Council of Ricks, the governing body of the Citadel, to answer for these murders. He denies involvement. The council doesn't believe him. He's placed under interdimensional arrest, his portal gun is confiscated, and he's taken to the Citadel, while Morty is placed in a kind of protective Morty custody, a room full of other Mortys supervised by council security. What follows is an investigation that takes our Rick and Morty across dimensions, chasing leads about who is actually committing the murders and framing Rick. And the trail eventually leads them to something they weren't expecting: another Rick. One who has been turned into, essentially, a puppet. This is Evil Rick. And Evil Rick, when Rick and Morty find his lair, is a genuinely disturbing figure. He has walls covered with Morty brains. Not metaphorically, actual Morty brain matter, harvested and displayed in what appears to be some kind of machine interface. There are hundreds of Morty eyes peering from the walls. It's an image designed to be deeply unsettling, and it succeeds. The immediate implication is that this Rick, this __quote_18__ has been doing horrific things to Mortys, using them as experimental material, as components in some kind of system, and discarding them when they're no longer useful. But then comes the reveal. When Evil Rick is defeated and his control system is examined, our Rick and the Council of Ricks discover something unexpected. Evil Rick wasn't acting autonomously, he was being controlled remotely through a device wired into his head. His actions were being directed by someone else, someone who had been running Evil Rick like a puppet, making him kill other Ricks, making him harvest Morty brains, making him do all the things that would eventually point the investigation in our Rick's direction, framing our Rick for the murders. And the controller? The person at the other end of that control interface? It's a Morty. Specifically, it's a Morty wearing an eye patch over his left eye. He's sitting in a control room with a device connecting him to Evil Rick's neural interface, running the whole operation. And when he's discovered, when the show reveals what he is, he doesn't panic. He doesn't beg or plead. He sits there, calm and still, and looks directly at whoever is looking at him. And then he escapes. He slips away into the crowd of Mortys that fills the Citadel, indistinguishable from any other Morty once the eye patch is removed, lost immediately in the sea of identical faces. This is Evil Morty's first appearance, and it's worth unpacking carefully because everything about this scene is deliberate, and everything in it tells you something about who this character is. First, consider the operational sophistication of what he's he's done. He has, apparently over a significant period of time, built a remote control interface for a Rick. Not a simple one, a device complex enough to direct that Rick's behavior in detail, to make him commit specific murders in specific ways, to frame a specific other Rick for those murders, and to maintain that deception well enough that it takes several episodes of investigation to unravel. Building something like that requires intelligence, technical skill, patience, and a plan that accounts for many possible counter moves. It's not something you do on impulse, it's something you design carefully over time. Second, consider who the target of that plan is. Evil Morty isn't targeting some random element of the multiverse, he's targeting Ricks. Specifically, he's doing two things simultaneously. He's using one Rick as a weapon against other Ricks, and he's framing a third Rick, our Rick, for the resulting chaos. He's using Ricks against each other. He's turned the most powerful figure in the universe into a controllable instrument, and he's pointed that instrument at the institution of Rick. This is not the action of someone who is afraid of Ricks or who sees Ricks as inherently superior and untouchable. This is the action of someone who has studied how Ricks work, who understands their vulnerabilities and their blind spots, and who has developed a plan to exploit those vulnerabilities to his own ends. Third, consider the use of Morty brains. This is the most disturbing element of the lair, and it's important to understand what it represents. The mass of Morty brain matter connected to Evil Rick's control system is, as far as the show indicates, a functional component of the device. The brainwaves of Mortys, the same brainwaves that serve as camouflage for Ricks, are apparently being used here as a kind of raw material. Evil Morty has, in other words, used the very thing that makes Mortys useful to Ricks as the mechanism of his own control over a Rick. He's taken the resource that defines Morty's relationship to Ricks in the broader world and turned it into a tool of his own making. There's a kind of grim logic to that, using the system's own raw material to build a weapon against the system. Now, this is also the most morally complicated element of Evil Morty's first appearance. Because those Morty brains came from somewhere, those were Mortys. Whether they were already dead when he used them, whether they were killed for this purpose, or whether the exact nature of how they ended up in those walls is something the show deliberately leaves ambiguous. The fact remains that there was a cost paid in Mortys for what Evil Morty built. And whatever his motivations, whatever the system was doing to Mortys, that cost is real and it's significant. The show is not asking you to simply admire Evil Morty. It's asking you to hold his intelligence and his grievance and the cost of his methods in your mind simultaneously. This is one of the things Rick and Morty does better than most animated shows. It refuses to simplify its morally complex characters. Evil Morty is someone who has a genuine grievance and who acts on that grievance in ways that cause genuine harm. Both things are true, and the show doesn't resolve the tension between them. It leaves you with the tension, which is a more honest position than pretending it doesn't exist. Fourth, and this is the detail that most reveals his character, he escapes by becoming invisible. Not literally invisible, he just takes off the eye patch and disappears into the crowd of Mortys. He's safe because he's indistinguishable. He's one of thousands of identical faces, and no one is looking for him specifically because in a crowd of Mortys, no one looks at Mortys specifically. They're interchangeable. The institution that was designed to keep Rick safe and in control doesn't have systems set up to look carefully at individual Mortys because Mortys are not considered interesting enough, dangerous enough, or capable enough to warrant that level of scrutiny. Their very status as overlooked and underestimated is his escape route. It's a quietly brilliant moment. Evil Morty escapes the most heavily Rick-secured place in the universe, not by fighting his way out, not by using some impressive technology, but by relying on the prejudice of his enemies. He knows that in a system where Mortys are overlooked, the best place to hide is in plain sight. The system's condescension toward Mortys is itself a vulnerability, and he exploits it perfectly. This escape also tells us something about his long-term thinking. He's not just planning this one operation. The way he escapes suggests he anticipated that this operation might fail and that he might need to disappear into the Citadel population. He's built his escape route into the mission plan. He's thinking several steps ahead, accounting for failure states and making sure he survives regardless of whether the immediate objective is achieved. That kind of thinking is not reactive, it's strategic. Now, what was his objective in this first appearance, and was he successful? At the surface level, the objective of the operation was to kill Ricks and frame our Rick for the murders, causing chaos within the Council of Ricks and the broader Citadel establishment. Did he succeed? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. He didn't manage to get our Rick convicted convicted and punished. Our Rick proves his innocence, and the framing falls apart when Evil Rick's control setup is discovered. But Evil Morty does escape, and the chaos he caused within the Council of Ricks is real. He demonstrated that a Morty could build a device capable of controlling a Rick. He demonstrated that the Council's security apparatus has significant blind spots, and he escaped from under the nose of what is ostensibly the most powerful governing body in the multiverse. That's not nothing. That's a significant proof of concept, and it sets the stage for everything that comes after. What we don't know at this point in the show is what drives him. The Season 1 appearance gives us his actions, his intelligence, his methods, and his capacity for planning, but it doesn't give us his motivation, at least not explicitly. We know he's working against the Council of Ricks. We know he's willing to do harmful things in service of that goal. We know he's patient and intelligent, but the why, the deeper reason behind the whole operation, isn't something Season 1 answers. For that, you have to wait until Season 5, where more about his background and relationship to Rick is revealed. But even without that context, the first appearance gives us something important, the template for who this character is. A Morty who is extraordinarily capable, who is not defined by any of the characteristics that typically define Mortys in the Citadel's hierarchy, who has decided to act against the system rather than within it, and who is willing to bear significant costs in pursuit of that goal. The question the first appearance leaves you with is simple. Why? Why has this Morty decided that the Council of Ricks is his enemy? What happened to him that made this the direction he chose? What does he want beyond the disruption of the immediate operation? Answering those questions fully requires going through the rest of his story. But before we do that, we need to go to Season 3, to the election, to the moment when Evil Morty stops being a shadow in the system and starts becoming its master. Because the election is where his strategy shifts from sabotage to something far more ambitious, infiltration from within. There's one more thing worth noting about the first appearance before we move on. The eye patch. When Evil Morty is revealed in Season 1, the eye patch is clearly a practical element. It's part of the control interface, connected somehow to the device that controls Evil Rick. But it's also a visual marker, and the show uses it deliberately. The eye patch says that this Morty has been through something specific. It says that he carries a physical mark of whatever that experience was. And when he removes the eye patch to blend back into the crowd, that removal is a kind of performance. He's concealing his mark, putting on the appearance of an ordinary Morty in order to survive. He's hiding what he is. He'll keep hiding what he is for 2 more seasons. He's patient enough to wait, strategic enough to plan, and smart enough to understand that the right moment hasn't come yet. The right moment comes in Season 3, when the Citadel is rebuilding itself after catastrophic damage, when the political environment is in flux, when a new kind of possibility is opening up within the system. And Evil Morty, from wherever he's been hiding in that crowd of Mortys, sees the moment arrive and steps into it. Section 6. Evil Morty and the Citadel Election. By the time we reach Season 3, Episode 7, the Ricklantis mix-up, the Citadel has gone through a significant transformation. Following the events of Season 3's premiere, __quote_20__ Rick C-137 was in a very dangerous position, held prisoner by the Galactic Federation, and the version of the Citadel that existed at that point in the show's timeline had already been the backdrop for considerable political drama. Rick ultimately escaped, and in the process of that escape, he made choices that had significant consequences for the Citadel and its political structure. What you need to understand going into Season 3, Episode 7 is that the Citadel has been partially destroyed and then rebuilt. There's been a disruption to its established order. The old power structures have been shaken. The political environment is unstable, and when political environments are unstable, when old certainties have been disrupted, spaces open up that weren't there before. Spaces for new voices, new movements, new possibilities that the system's usual inertia would have prevented from emerging in calmer times. Evil Morty sees this space, and he steps into it. He appears in this episode as __quote_21__ running in the election for president of the Citadel. But it's important to understand what the episode actually shows us about his campaign, because it's easy to summarize it reductively as __quote_22__, which is true, but misses a lot of what's actually interesting about how he does it and what the show is saying through his success. Let's start with the election itself and the broader political context the episode depicts. The Citadel, in the wake of its reconstruction, has decided to hold a democratic election for its leadership, and the candidates who emerge in that election are, almost exclusively, Ricks. Ricks, specific, named Rick candidates who represent different political positions within the Citadel's existing framework of Rick-dominated politics. One candidate is a populist Rick who talks to the working-class Ricks and Mortys about economic concerns. Another represents a more establishment position. The race going into the election is expected to be between these Rick candidates. That's who the Citadel's political institution has been designed to accommodate as serious contenders for real power. Then, candidate Morty shows up. His campaign is built around something very specific: the experience and perspective of Mortys within the Citadel system. He talks to Mortys about their lives in a way that the Rick candidates don't, because the Rick candidates haven't been living those lives and don't fully understand them. He speaks directly to the economic and social vulnerabilities of Mortys in the Citadel, the factory work, the inequality, the lack of meaningful representation in the institution's actual decision-making, and Mortys respond. They respond because what he's saying is true, because it matches what they experience every day, and because no one in a position of power has ever talked to them like this before. This is worth pausing on, because it would be easy to dismiss candidate Morty's appeal as pure manipulation, to say that he's just cynically exploiting the genuine grievances of Mortys in order to achieve a personal goal that has nothing to do with their welfare. And there is truth in that reading. His ultimate actions after winning the election make clear that his personal agenda is not the same as the welfare of the Mortys who voted for him. The things he does after taking power are not oriented toward improving the institutional conditions of Morty life. But that reading misses something important, which is that the grievances he speaks to are real, regardless of whether he personally cares about resolving them. The Mortys who vote for him are not stupid. They're not being deceived about the nature of their situation. When he talks about the inequality in the Citadel, about the way Mortys are treated within the system, about the absence of genuine Morty representation at the levels of real power, he's not making any of that up. He's describing something real, and the Mortys who respond to that description are responding to their own lived experience being accurately named for the first time by someone who appears to be in a position to do something about it. The fact that he's not actually planning to address those structural issues doesn't negate the validity of the issues themselves, and the show is careful to keep those two things distinct: the genuine injustice of the Citadel's treatment of Mortys and Evil Morty's particular relationship to that injustice. One is real and documented, the other is complicated and ambiguous. The show shows you both. The episode also shows us how he handles his competition within the election. Several of the Rick candidates die during the campaign in ways that are, by the end of the episode, clearly not coincidental. Evil Morty, as candidate Morty, is systematically eliminating the competition. Not openly, not in ways that can be traced directly back to him. The deaths appear to be accidents or unconnected events, but the pattern, viewed from the outside, is clear. He's removing the obstacles to his election with the same methodical, patient efficiency that characterized his first appearance in Season 1. This is where the moral complexity gets thickest, because you can look at what he's doing and describe it straightforwardly as political assassination, as the ruthless elimination of democratic competition, as a fundamental betrayal of the very democratic process he's ostensibly participating in. And all of that is accurate. What he's doing is genuinely wrong in this dimension, genuinely harmful, genuinely a corruption of the political process. But you can also look at the candidates he's eliminating and understand that the Rick-dominated political structure of the Citadel was never going to produce an outcome that meaningfully changed anything for Mortys. If you believe, if Evil Morty believes, and there's reason to think he does, that the Citadel's democratic process is itself a managed thing, a performance of representation that doesn't actually distribute power in a way that threatens Rick's supremacy, then the question of whether it's ethical to corrupt that process becomes more complicated. You can't corrupt something that's already corrupted. You can only participate in the corruption or step outside it entirely. And stepping outside it, in this context, isn't an available option. Not if you want to achieve something within the system. So he does what he does. He wins the election. He becomes president of the Citadel. And then the episode shows us what he does with that power in its final moments. He purges. Systematically and thoroughly, he identifies the members of the Citadel's establishment who know what he is or who represent a threat to his position. Specifically, the corrupt Ricks who have been running the Citadel's shadow operations. The ones who have been manipulating the political process for their own benefit. The ones who represent the most entrenched elements of the old power structure. And he removes them, not through democratic process, not through institutional reform, through force. force, directly and decisively. The episode ends with Rick C-137 and the main Morty being completely unaware of any of this. They've been on an adventure the whole time, hence the title __quote_23___, while Evil Morty, sitting in his new presidential office at the top of the Citadel, has just consolidated his control over the most powerful Rick and Morty institution in the multiverse. The final shot of him in that episode is one of the most quietly chilling images in the entire show. He's sitting in the presidential chair, calm and composed, eyes looking directly forward, with no particular expression on his face. He's not gloating, he's not celebrating. He's done what he set out to do, and now he's thinking about what comes next. And what comes next, apparently, is waiting, strategizing, building whatever it is he needs to build in order to execute the next stage of a plan that extends well beyond the presidency. Between Season 3 and Season 5, we see very little of the Citadel. The show's main narrative continues with Rick and Morty's adventures, and the Citadel operates as a background institution, something that exists that occasionally has implications for the main storyline, but that is not the show's primary focus during this period. Evil Morty, as Citadel president, is a fact of the world during this time, but the show doesn't show us in detail what he's doing with that position. What Season 5 eventually reveals is that he's been using it. Specifically, he's been using the Citadel's enormous scientific and technological resources to work on a problem that has nothing to do with Citadel politics or the welfare of its Morty population, and everything to do with something much larger. He's been working on the Central Finite Curve, but before we get to the curve, we need to understand what it is. Because the Central Finite Curve is the most important piece of conceptual architecture in Evil Morty's entire story, and it's also one of the most important ideas in the entire show. It's the key to understanding not just what Evil Morty eventually does, but why he does it and what it means. Section 7, the Central Finite Curve. One of the things that makes Rick and Morty work as a piece of storytelling is the consistency of its underlying cosmology. The show plays around a lot with reality and consequence and what it means to have access to infinite universes. It uses that premise for comedy, for philosophical exploration, for plot convenience. But underneath all of that, there are certain rules, certain structural facts about how the show's universe works that remain consistent and that the show respects. The Central Finite Curve is the most significant of those structural facts. It's the one that, when it's explained in Season 5, Episode 10, __quote_24__, retroactively reshapes your understanding of what the entire show has been about from the beginning. It's the reveal that changes the meaning of the context. So what is the Central Finite Curve? The simplest explanation comes directly from the show. In Rickmurai Jack, Evil Morty describes it in terms that are clear enough to follow. The multiverse, as presented in Rick and Morty, is infinite. There are infinite versions of reality, infinite timelines, infinite dimensions. This is established from very early in the show and is consistent throughout. Ricks with portal guns can navigate this infinite multiverse, visiting different versions of reality, interacting with infinite variants of any given person or situation. But Rick, not a specific Rick, but Rick as a category, Rick as the kind of being Rick is, built something. He built a boundary, a wall, not a physical wall, but a conceptual and technological one, a curve that selects from the infinite space of all possible realities a specific subset. That subset is defined by a single criterion. It contains only the realities where Rick is the smartest being in the universe. Every version of reality where Rick is not the most intelligent entity has been placed outside this curve, on the other side of the wall, beyond the reach of Rick's portal gun. This is the Central Finite Curve. It is the portion of the multiverse defined by, organized around, and maintained in service of a single ego's supremacy. Let that sit for a moment. The entire universe that Rick navigates, the whole infinite space of all the dimensions and timelines and alternate realities that the show has ever explored, all of the adventures, all of the Citadels, all of the Mortys, everything is contained within a deliberately constructed prison. Not a prison that traps its inhabitants through visible walls, but a prison that defines the accessible universe as only those realities where one specific type of being is always in charge. The show had been gesturing at this idea for a long time before it was made explicit. The Council of Ricks, the Citadel, the fact that Rick seems to always be the smartest person in the room, regardless of where in the universe he goes, these were always hints that something systematic was happening. But the explanation in Season 5 makes it concrete. The reason Rick is always the most capable, the most powerful, the most influential figure in the universes the show visits visits is not random. It's structural. It's the result of a selection criterion that was built by Rick himself, consciously, to ensure that the accessible multiverse is always a place where Rick is on top. There's something deeply narcissistic about this, not in a petty way, but in a profound, encompassing way. The Central Finite Curve is the most elaborate expression of a specific kind of ego that the show has been characterizing throughout its run. Rick cannot tolerate existing in a universe where he is not special. So, rather than confronting that limitation, rather than learning to exist in a reality where other beings might be smarter, more capable, or more powerful, Rick built a wall around the parts of reality where he doesn't have to confront it. He literally restructured the accessible multiverse to guarantee his own supremacy within it. And every entity that lives within that curve, every Rick, every Morty, every citizen of every planet the show has ever visited, every political system and species and civilization that operates within the show's explored universe is living inside that guarantee. They don't know about it, most of them. They just live their lives within a universe that has been pre-selected to ensure that Rick is always near the top. The infinite creativity and variety of the multiverse has been filtered through a single criterion, and what remains after that filtering is the universe we've been watching. This has implications that go in several directions at once. The most immediately visible implication is what it means for Rick's self-perception. Rick's identity is built heavily around his intelligence. He defines himself, presents himself to others, and understands his place in the world primarily in terms of how smart he is, how much more he can see, understand, and do than everyone around him. And within the Central Finite Curve, that self-perception is confirmed at every turn. Of course, Rick is the smartest person in the room. He built the room to ensure that's the case, but he experiences it as evidence of who he naturally is, rather than as the product of a system he constructed. The curve allows Rick to live inside a confirmation bias of cosmic scale, a universe that constantly tells him what he wants to hear about himself, without ever having to acknowledge that he's the one who built it to do that. The second implication is what it means for everyone else within the curve, for every non-Rick who has been living inside this structure without knowing it exists. Every adventure Rick and Morty have ever gone on, every civilization they've visited, every friend and enemy they've encountered, all of that has happened within a pre-selected subset of reality, a subset chosen specifically to make Rick feel important. The rest of the multiverse, the infinite realities beyond the curve, the dimensions where Rick's intelligence doesn't grant him automatic supremacy, has simply been inaccessible, removed from the menu. For Mortys specifically, this means something particularly stark. Mortys, who live their entire lives within the Citadel, within the universe of Rick's adventures, within the Central Finite Curve, they exist in a reality that has been specifically designed to ensure that they will always be in the presence of Ricks, who are the most powerful beings around. The structural conditions that make Rick's supremacy feel natural and inevitable, that make the Rick-Morty dynamic feel like just the way things are not accidents of nature. They are the result of deliberate choices made by Ricks to guarantee those conditions. The curve ensures that the world Mortys live in is always one where Ricks have the most power. The third implication, the one most directly relevant to Evil Morty's story, is that there are realities beyond the curve. Realities where Rick is not the smartest being. Realities where the structural facts are different. Realities where the particular logic of Rick's supremacy doesn't organize everything. Those realities are out there. They are not accessible through Rick's standard portal technology. The green portal gun operates within the curve by design, but they exist. And if you could get outside the curve, you would find yourself in a part of the multiverse that has never been touched by Rick's particular organizational logic. Evil Morty finds this out, and once he finds it out, everything he does subsequently is oriented toward one goal: getting out there. How does he find out about the curve? The show doesn't give us a scene of discovery. We don't watch the moment when Evil Morty learns that the curve exists. What the show gives us instead is the effect. By season 5, Evil Morty has clearly known about the curve for some time, has understood its implications, and has been building toward the capacity to break through it. His presidency of the Citadel, in retrospect, was not an end in itself. It was a means to an end. Access to the Citadel's resources, its scientific infrastructure, its vast technological capacity. Resources that could be used to do something no one inside the curve had ever done before. There's something worth noting about the specific language the show uses when Evil Morty explains the curve. In his explanation, he describes it as something Rick built. Not all Ricks collectively, not the institution institution of Rick, not the Council of Ricks as a governing body, but Rick, the singular. The implication is that one specific Rick at some point built the curve, and the Rick most likely to have done something like that, the Rick who, in the show's established narrative, is the most driven and capable and extreme in his actions, is Rick C137, our Rick. The show doesn't state this explicitly in quote 26 but the broader narrative of season 5, which involves revelations about Rick C137's specific backstory and his particular relationship to the Citadel and to the broader multiverse, makes the connection available to be drawn. Rick C137 is not just a Rick who happens to live within the curve, he is, in a very specific and personal way, connected to the construction and maintenance of the curve. And Evil Morty's relationship to Rick C137, which season 5 also makes more explicit, connects back to this, but we'll discuss that connection in the next section when we talk about Evil Morty's motivations. For now, the important thing to establish is what the curve represents as a concept, because it's the central symbol of everything the show is exploring through Evil Morty's arc. The Central Finite Curve is the ultimate version of the control structure we've been discussing throughout this video. The Citadel is a control structure, Rick-dominated, organized around Rick's supremacy, maintained by Rick power. But the Citadel is embedded in a larger control structure, which is the curve. The curve is the invisible architecture that makes the Citadel's logic feel natural. It's the reason that in every accessible dimension, Rick is the most powerful figure. It's the reason that the Rick-Morty dynamic repeats across the multiverse, because the multiverse, as accessible through Rick's portals, was designed to produce that repetition. In this reading, Evil Morty is not just fighting the Citadel, he's fighting something much larger than the Citadel. He's fighting the fundamental structure of the accessible universe, the selection criterion that has made Rick's supremacy the defining fact of interdimensional reality. And his method is not to reform that structure from within, not to change the curve's criteria, not to build a better Citadel. His method is to break through the curve entirely and get out. There's something worth saying about the coherence of that goal. It would be possible to imagine a Morty who reacted to discovering the curve by trying to reform it, by trying to change its selection criteria so that it includes more types of realities, or by trying to redistribute power within the curve's existing structure so that Mortys have more of it. Evil Morty doesn't try to do that, and whether that's because he's tried and concluded it can't be done, or because he's made a philosophical judgment that the curve itself is the problem and can't be fixed, only escaped, we can't say for certain. What we can say is that his response to the curve is the most radical possible one. Not reform, not redistribution, escape. Total, complete, irreversible escape from the entire system. And to execute that escape, he needs to destroy the thing that maintains the curve in the first place. He needs to destroy the Citadel. Section 8. Why Evil Morty wanted to escape. Understanding why Evil Morty wants to escape, not just what he's escaping from, which we've spent considerable time on, but why this particular Morty and not any other, requires going to season 5, specifically to Rickmurai Jack, and examining the backstory that the episode begins to reveal. Season 5 provides more context for Evil Morty's connection to Rick C137 specifically. What the episode reveals, through a sequence of memories and reconstructed events depicted through the specific imagery the show uses to convey Rick's past, is that Evil Morty was not always the composed, strategic figure we've seen him become. He was once a Morty who had a Rick. Specifically, he was a Morty who had Rick C137. This is the crucial piece of information, and it changes everything about how you read Evil Morty's story. He's not some random Morty who became radicalized by the general injustice of the Citadel's structure. He's a Morty who had a specific personal experience with the specific Rick at the center of the entire narrative. The person who built or reinforced the Central Finite Curve. The person who is, in many ways, the paradigmatic Rick around whom the entire system revolves is the same person who was Evil Morty's Rick. What we see in the season 5 backstory is that Rick C137 went through multiple Mortys during a period before the main storyline begins. Not one Morty, not just the Morty we know, multiple Mortys, in a pattern that suggests Rick was going through companions at a rate that implies something was going wrong in those relationships, or that he was using them in ways that didn't preserve them. The imagery shown in that episode depicts Rick working with or on multiple Mortys in ways that are are, at best, instrumentalizing, treating the Morty as a resource or a tool rather than as a person. The show doesn't spell out in explicit detail exactly what happened between Rick C-137 and each of these prior Mortys, including the Morty who would become Evil Morty. The narrative gives you images and implications more than explicit scenes of specific events. But the implication is clear enough. There was a Morty who went through something, and that something involved Rick C-137 treating him in a way that was harmful, that prioritized Rick's interests or projects over that Morty's well-being and autonomy, and that left a mark.
Literally, in the case of the eye patch, figuratively, in every other way. And the Morty who went through that experience didn't break. He didn't become passive or defeated. He became Evil Morty. This origin makes the character significantly more comprehensible and significantly more tragic simultaneously. It's comprehensible because it gives the personal dimension to what might otherwise look like purely ideological opposition to a system. Evil Morty isn't just philosophically opposed to Rick's control of the multiverse. He has personal experience of what that control looks like at the individual level. He knows from his own life what it feels like to be a Morty in a relationship with a Rick who treats the Morty as a means rather than an end. He's not arguing from principle alone, he's arguing from experience. And it's tragic because the experience that created him is not some elaborate systemic evil. It's the ordinary day-to-day texture of the Rick-Morty relationship taken to its logical conclusion. A relationship where the power differential is so entrenched and the system that maintains it is so all-encompassing that even the Rick who might care about his Morty can cause serious harm through the ordinary exercise of that power. Rick C-137 is not, as far as the show establishes, a uniquely monstrous Rick. He's a Rick who does what Ricks do, with the resources and tools and habits of mind that Ricks have. And what Ricks do, at scale, creates Evil Mortys. This personal origin also explains the specific target of Evil Morty's anger. His opposition to the system is not abstract. He's not a philosopher who looked at the structure of the multiverse and concluded that it was unjust. He's someone who lived that injustice, who experienced it in the form of a specific relationship with a specific Rick, and who carries the memory of that experience in his body, in that eye patch, in the specific quality of composed, controlled fury that defines his whole character. The anger is personal before it's systemic. The systemic critique follows from the personal wound. Understanding this also helps explain the apparent coldness of Evil Morty's demeanor. Throughout all three of his major appearances, he is remarkably unemotional. Not in the sense of being robotic or blank, there's clearly a great deal happening beneath the surface, but in the sense that he doesn't display emotion openly, doesn't perform affect, doesn't let his feelings become visible in ways that could be used against him or that could interfere with his plans. He's learned, presumably through experience, that emotional display in a world controlled by Rick is a vulnerability. Rick is an expert at using emotional leverage. The Ricks of the Citadel are not above exploiting sentiment or confusion or distress in others to maintain their position. If you want to survive in that world and eventually do something about it, you learn not to give your enemies a lever to pull. So Evil Morty's composure is not the absence of feeling, it's the containment of feeling in service of a long-term goal. He has, apparently over years, channeled whatever emotions were produced by his experience with Rick into a disciplined, focused plan. And the plan is not to hurt Rick personally, not to exact revenge in any personal sense, but to destroy the system that made Rick what he is, that made the Rick-Morty dynamic what it is, and then to escape entirely from the universe that system created. The absence of personal vindictiveness is actually one of the most interesting things about Evil Morty. He doesn't seem to want Rick to suffer. He doesn't seem to want to confront Rick directly, to expose him, to make him understand what he did. He doesn't seek that confrontation. What he seeks is out. Complete, total, irrevocable departure from the world that Rick defined. The goal is not to defeat Rick within the system, it's to leave the system so thoroughly that Rick can no longer be relevant to his existence. That's a different kind of response than revenge. Revenge would keep him connected to Rick, would keep Rick at the center of his story, because the point of revenge is to act back upon the person who hurt you. What Evil Morty does instead is something that's harder to characterize, but ultimately more complete. He makes Rick irrelevant. He goes somewhere that Rick can't follow, to a part of the multiverse where the entire organizational logic that makes Rick important simply doesn't apply. There's something about that choice, the choice of escape over confrontation, that says something specific about how Evil Morty understands the situation. He understands understands, apparently, that engaging Rick within the system on Rick's terms is not a viable path to actually changing anything. The system is too large, too self-reinforcing, and too thoroughly organized around Rick's supremacy to be reformed from within. You can't beat Rick at his own game because the game was designed by Rick and is being played on a board of Rick's construction. The only way to win is to stop playing. The only way to be truly free is to be somewhere that the game doesn't exist. This understanding that the system cannot be reformed, only escaped, is the philosophical core of Evil Morty's entire project, and it's a genuinely radical position. Most of the other characters in the show who become aware of injustice in their world respond by trying to change things from within. Rick's daughter Beth and her husband Jerry navigate the tensions of their lives through the available options within the world they're given. Even Rick himself, when he acts against institutions he dislikes, the Galactic Federation, the Council of Ricks, various other governing bodies, he acts against them in specific ways for specific reasons and then continues to exist within the broader structure of the accessible multiverse. He doesn't try to escape the structure itself, he just dominates within it. Evil Morty is the only character who decides that the structure itself is the problem, not this institution or that one, not this Rick or that Citadel government, the whole thing, the Central Finite Curve, the organizational logic of a multiverse that was built to make Rick matter. That is what he decides has to go, and the depth of that decision, the completeness of his willingness to burn down everything within the system in order to get outside it is what makes his story the most morally complex in the show. Because he's right about the system. The show shows us consistently and clearly that the system is unjust, but the methods he uses to escape it, the killings, the political manipulation, the destruction, cause real harm to real people who exist within that system. The factory Mortys who lose their home when the Citadel is destroyed. The Ricks and Mortys who die in the chaos. The individuals, many of whom are not powerful players in the system, but are simply people trying to live their lives within it. Evil Morty's escape costs something, not just in an abstract sense, but in the concrete sense of specific harm to specific people. And the show doesn't let you forget that, but it also shows you what it costs to not escape, what it costs to stay, what the system does to the people who can't or won't get out. The question of which cost is more important, the cost of the escape or the ongoing cost of staying inside the system, is one the show deliberately doesn't answer. It gives you the information, it leaves the weighing to you. There's also something worth acknowledging about the particular nature of what Evil Morty is escaping to, not just what he's escaping from. The Central Finite Curve, as established by the show, is the selection of realities where Rick is the smartest being. Beyond the curve are realities that were excluded from Rick's accessible multiverse, realities that didn't meet the criterion. We don't know what those realities are like. The show doesn't show us. Evil Morty escapes into an unknown, into a part of the multiverse that no one within the curve has ever visited, and the show doesn't tell us what he finds there. That's appropriate. That's true to the character's decision. He's not escaping to somewhere he knows is better. He's escaping from something he knows is wrong. That's a different kind of choice, a harder one in some ways, because it requires trusting that the unknown is preferable to the known injustice. It requires a willingness to face genuine uncertainty, a universe you've never been to, governed by logic you don't understand, with no guarantee that what you find there will be kinder than what you left. Most people, when confronted with that choice, choose the known, even a known that's unjust. At least it's familiar, at least you understand how it works and where you are within it. The unknown is genuinely frightening. Evil Morty chooses the unknown, without hesitation, without looking back. And to get there, he has to do one last thing. He has to break through. Section 9, Breaking the System. Season 5, Episode 10, Rickmurai Jack, is the season finale and the episode where everything Evil Morty has been building toward finally arrives. It's also the episode that reveals, in more detail than any previous appearance, who he is and what happened to make him what he became. The episode handles him with real care. It gives him screen time and weight, and most importantly, it gives him an explanation that doesn't reduce him to a simple villain or a simple hero, but leaves him in the complicated space between those categories where he's always belonged. The episode takes place partly in our main storyline, Rick and Morty's continuing relationship and the specific tensions of that season, and partly in Evil Morty's storyline, which by this point has converged with theirs in ways the show has been building toward. The two storylines meet in the episode's latter section, when Evil Morty's plan
plan reaches its execution phase. But let's start with what the episode reveals about his plan before we get to the execution. Evil Morty has been, as established, in control of the Citadel since Season 3's election, and he has been using that control not to reform Citadel society, not to improve conditions for its Morty population, and not to pursue any conventional political agenda. He's been using it to build something. Specifically, he's been using the Citadel's enormous scientific resources, its technology, its research infrastructure, its accumulated knowledge, to develop a way to breach the Central Finite Curve, to build a portal that goes not just between dimensions within the curve, but through the curve itself and beyond. This is technically ambitious in a way the show depicts with appropriate gravity. Rick's portal technology, the standard green portal gun, operates within the curve. It's been calibrated, deliberately or as a consequence of its construction, to navigate within the subset of realities that the curve defines. Breaking through the curve isn't just a matter of going to a new destination. It requires a fundamentally different kind of navigation, different physics, different portal architecture, a different approach to interdimensional travel that the existing technology wasn't built to accomplish. Evil Morty has spent what appears to be years, the entire time between Season 3 and Season 5, solving that problem. The resources of the Citadel, the scientific capacity of thousands of Ricks and their technology, all directed by Evil Morty toward this single goal. And by the time Rickmurai Jack reaches its climax, he's done it. He has the technology to go through the curve. The remaining problem is energy. Breaking through the curve requires an enormous amount of power, more power than the Citadel's standard infrastructure can easily provide. And so, Evil Morty's final plan, the thing the episode builds toward, is to use the Citadel itself as a power source for the breakthrough. Not the Citadel's generators, not its fuel reserves, but the Citadel itself, its physical and dimensional mass, and the energy that can be extracted by its destruction. He destroys the Citadel to power the portal. Let that land. Evil Morty's plan, in its final stage, involves destroying the institution that gave him his platform, the institution that housed thousands of Ricks and Mortys, the entire civilization that exists within the Citadel, using the energy released by that destruction to power the dimensional breach that gets him out of the Central Finite Curve. This is, by any measure, an act of mass destruction. The Citadel is not a small place. It's a city in the way a floating interdimensional station can be a city. Populated, inhabited, a place where thousands of beings live their daily lives. What he does to it is not metaphorical or symbolic. He destroys it. The inhabitants die, the infrastructure collapses, the institution that was the center of Rick-Morty politics across the accessible multiverse ceases to exist. And the show shows you that destruction. Not triumphantly, not with the kind of visual language it uses for action sequences, where the audience is meant to feel the hero's victory. The destruction of the Citadel in __quote_30__ is depicted with a certain sobriety. You see the scale of what's being lost. You see the Citadel, a whole society, coming apart. And while the show has been making the case across several episodes for why the Citadel's power structure was unjust and harmful, it doesn't use that established injustice to make the destruction feel consequence-free. The cost is visible. At the same time, the show gives you the context that makes the destruction at least comprehensible, if not simply justifiable. The Citadel, as Evil Morty has been building to this moment, has been consistently shown to be an institution that was harming people. Not incidentally, not occasionally, but structurally and consistently. The Factory Mortys, the Cop Rick and Cop Morty storyline, the entire political apparatus that was designed to maintain Rick supremacy while offering Mortys a performance of representation, all of that has been shown in detail. The institution being destroyed is not a neutral party. It's a specific system of power, and the destruction of it is the direct consequence of what that system chose to be. There's a sequence in the episode where Rick and Evil Morty are directly in each other's presence, and the show allows for a brief confrontation between them. What's striking about that confrontation is Evil Morty's clarity. He is not angry in the way you might expect. He is not bitter, not screaming, not righteously furious. He's composed in the way he's always been composed, with a kind of contained, clear-eyed intensity that makes what he's saying more uncomfortable than a screaming tirade would. He explains the curve. He explains what it represents. He explains what he's doing and why. And Rick's response to that explanation is one of the more complex moments the show has given Rick. Because Rick can't simply dismiss what Evil Morty is saying. He knows the curve exists. He knows what it represents. He knows the role role he played in its construction or maintenance. And the fact that he doesn't try to argue Evil Morty out of his conclusion, doesn't try to make the case that the curve is actually fine, actually good, actually justified, tells you something about Rick's own complicated relationship to the system he's built and benefited from. Rick lets Evil Morty go. Whether this is a deliberate choice, a strategic calculation, or a recognition that stopping him is not something Rick wants to do in that moment, the show leaves some ambiguity around it. But Evil Morty proceeds with his plan, and Rick doesn't stop him. The breach of the curve is depicted through the show's visual language in a very specific way. The portal that Evil Morty uses to escape is not the standard green of Rick's portals. It's yellow. That distinction, green inside the curve, yellow outside it, is not incidental. It's the show's way of marking that this is genuinely different, genuinely new, genuinely somewhere the show's universe hasn't gone before. The yellow portal goes somewhere that exists entirely outside the organizational logic of everything we've seen, somewhere that was never organized around Rick, somewhere that, by definition, is not under Rick's control or within Rick's design. Evil Morty walks through that yellow portal and it closes behind him. The Citadel's destruction continues, the chaos unfolds, and the character who set all of this in motion is simply gone into a part of the multiverse that the show cannot follow, at least not with any of its existing characters or tools. The visual of that portal closing is the most important image in Evil Morty's entire arc. Not the destruction of the Citadel, not the political maneuvering, not the cleverness of his plan. Just the closing of a yellow portal and the figure that's already passed through it into something new, while everything that was is collapsing behind him. The Citadel, in ruins, represents the end of something. The end of the most powerful Rick institution in the accessible multiverse. The end of the organized hierarchy that had governed interdimensional Rick and Morty politics. The end of the institutional infrastructure that maintained the system the show has been examining throughout Evil Morty's arc. That's a significant ending. Whatever the Citadel was, and the show has been clear about what it was, about its injustices and its power and its specific brand of control, it's gone now. What that means for the accessible multiverse going forward, the show doesn't fully address in Season 5. The absence of the Citadel has implications for Ricks, who relied on its infrastructure, for Mortys, who lived within it, for the broader interdimensional political balance. But Quote 31 doesn't spend its remaining runtime working through those implications in detail. It allows the destruction to stand as an event of its own weight, something whose full consequences haven't yet resolved. What the episode does spend its remaining moments on is the emotional landscape of Rick C-137, who is, by this point in the season, confronting things about his own past and his own choices that are uncomfortable in ways he's spent years avoiding. Rick's reaction to all of this, to the destruction of the Citadel, and to Evil Morty's escape, and to the specific revelations of this episode about his own backstory, is the emotional center of the finale. And while this essay is about Evil Morty rather than Rick, it's worth noting that Rick's emotional state at this point, the recognition of what he's built and what it's cost, is the show's way of putting a mirror to the system one more time. The show ends the episode not with triumph, not with resolution, but with a kind of open-ended heaviness. Things have changed. The Citadel is gone, Evil Morty is gone, beyond the curve, beyond Rick, beyond the accessible multiverse. Rick is still here, still dealing with the consequences of his choices. The universe within the curve continues, though it's been fundamentally altered by what just happened. And somewhere beyond the yellow portal, a Morty is navigating a part of reality that was never defined by Rick's organizational logic, for the first time in his life, completely free of the system that made him. What does he find there? What does that freedom actually look like? The show doesn't tell us. It may never tell us. And there's something appropriate about that silence, because the freedom Evil Morty sought was not a specific destination. It was the condition of being outside the system. Whatever he finds beyond the curve, it's not something the show's existing narrative has the tools to depict, because the show's existing narrative is itself within the curve, is itself structured by the same organizational logic that Evil Morty left behind. The absence of an answer about what lies beyond is the point. He went somewhere the story can't follow. In that, for a character who spent his entire arc trying to find a door, is the truest form of success the show could give him. Section 10. Was Evil Morty right? This is the question the whole essay has been building toward, and it's worth sitting with for a while before trying to say anything about it, because it's not a simple question, and anyone who tells you it has a simple answer probably hasn't been paying close enough attention to the show. Let's lay out what we know with confidence, based on everything the show has shown us. The Central Finite Curve exists. It was built deliberately by Rick.
Rick. It defines the accessible multiverse as only those realities where Rick is the smartest being in the universe. This is not a fan theory. This is not an interpretation. It's stated explicitly in Rickmurai Jack by Evil Morty himself in one of the episode's most clearly articulated moments of exposition. The curve is real, it was built, and it was built with a specific criterion that guaranteed Rick's supremacy within the accessible multiverse. The Citadel of Ricks exists.
It is a society organized around Rick's dominance, with Mortys in structurally subordinate positions. The inequality is real, as documented across Season 3, Episode 7, in the factory labor, the economic disparity, the political exclusion, the police violence against the Morty cop who tried to speak out. The harm the system does is not theoretical. It's depicted in specific scenes with specific characters, in ways the show clearly intends to be taken seriously. Evil Morty was harmed by Rick. The backstory revealed in Season 5 establishes that he had a personal experience with Rick C-137 that was harmful, that he was used, instrumentalized, damaged in ways that left marks both physical and otherwise. This harm is connected to the broader systemic pattern in which Ricks treat Mortys as resources rather than people, but it's also specifically personal, involving the particular Rick who is at the center of the entire show's narrative. Evil Morty's methods caused harm. The Morty brains used in his Season 1 operation, the political assassinations during the Season 3 election, the destruction of the Citadel, and the deaths that entailed. None of this is negated or resolved by the validity of his grievances. The harm he caused was real, it was significant, and the people who suffered it were not all-powerful players in the system he was fighting. Evil Morty escaped. He built a portal, used the Citadel's destruction to power it, and went through the Central Finite Curve into a part of the multiverse that exists beyond Rick's organizational logic. He is, as far as the show establishes, the only character to ever have done this. He is somewhere outside the accessible multiverse, in realities where the criterion of Rick's supremacy doesn't define the basic conditions of existence. These are the facts. The question of whether he was right has to be answered, if it can be answered at all. In relation to these facts, one way to approach the question is to separate it into its components. Was he right about the system? Was he right about the necessity of escape? And was he right in the methods he used to achieve that escape? On the first question, was he right about the system? The show makes the case pretty clearly. The Central Finite Curve is real. The Citadel's hierarchy is real. The structural disadvantage of Mortys within that hierarchy is real. The specific harm done to individual Mortys, the cop Morty killed for speaking out, the factory Mortys living in conditions of economic precarity, the Mortys harvested or used or discarded across various Rick adventures is real. The system he was fighting against is not a figment of his imagination or a misreading of an otherwise benign arrangement. It's a documented, concrete structure of power that does real and specific harm. So yes, on the question of whether the system he was opposing was unjust, the show answers yes. Not subtly, not ambiguously, but through consistent, specific depiction over multiple seasons. On the second question, was he right about the necessity of escape rather than reform? This is where things get more complicated, because quote_33_ is a real option, at least in principle, and Evil Morty never seems to seriously pursue it. He doesn't try to change the Citadel's labor policies. He doesn't try to restructure the educational system. He doesn't try to use his presidential power to redistribute resources or expand political representation for Mortys. He uses the presidential power entirely in service of his exit plan. This could be read as evidence that he's not really about justice for Mortys, that he's using Morty grievances as a tool for his own personal escape and always was. And there's truth in that reading. His personal experience with Rick C-137 is what drives him. His goal is his own freedom, not the systemic liberation of Morty kind. The Mortys who voted for him, believing he would improve their lives within the system, were in a real sense used. Their trust and their genuine need were exploited for someone else's agenda. But there's another way to read his choice of escape over reform, one that the show makes available without necessarily endorsing. If the system is organized at its deepest level around the Central Finite Curve, if the fundamental criterion of the accessible multiverse is that Rick is always on top, then reform within the system is always going to run into the same wall. You can improve conditions within the Citadel. You can give Mortys more resources, more representation, more dignity within the existing structure, but as long as the accessible multiverse is defined by Rick's supremacy, as long as the curve selects
only realities where that supremacy is the basic fact of interdimensional life, then the structural conditions that produce Rick dominance and Morty subordination will keep reproducing themselves. Reform within the curve addresses symptoms. It doesn't address the cause. This is the most intellectually serious version of Evil Morty's position, and it's the version that's hardest to dismiss. If the system is fundamentally structured around Rick's supremacy, not just in terms of the Citadel's specific institutions, but in terms of the basic reality selected by the curve, then reform isn't a real alternative. It's just a slower path to the same destination. The show doesn't confirm this reading. It doesn't give us evidence that reform within the Citadel would inevitably fail, but it doesn't give us evidence to the contrary either. What it gives us is a system that every time we see it is producing the same outcomes: Rick dominance, Morty subordination, the ongoing reproduction of the hierarchy through institutional structures that are resistant to change. Whether that reproduction is inevitable given the curve's existence, or whether it could be interrupted by sustained reform efforts from within, the show doesn't resolve. On the third question, was he right in his methods? This is the hardest question, and the one the show is most explicitly reluctant to answer. The methods he used caused real harm. People died. The Morty brains in his Season 1 operation represented lives used and discarded. The political figures who died during the Season 3 election campaign were, whatever their participation in the Citadel's corrupt structure, individual beings who were killed. The destruction of the Citadel killed or displaced an enormous population. Mortys who had done nothing to harm Evil Morty, Ricks of varying levels of complicity in the system's injustice, everyone who happened to be in that institution when it was used as fuel for his escape. The methods are not defensible in any straightforward moral sense, and the show doesn't try to make them defensible. It shows the harm they cause and leaves it in your field of vision. But the show also makes a related observation, implicit in the way it structured everything we've seen. The system Evil Morty was fighting didn't stop causing harm while he was figuring out how to fight it. The factory Mortys kept working their factory jobs. The cop Morty kept getting killed for speaking out. The Mortys kept getting used as neurological camouflage for Ricks who treated them as resources. The harm of the system was ongoing, continuous, happening every day to real beings. The question of how much harm is acceptable in order to end an ongoing harm is one of the oldest and most difficult questions in ethics, and the show does not pretend to answer it. What the show does instead is hold both things at once: the ongoing harm of the system and the harm of the methods used to dismantle it. It shows you both with equal clarity and equal seriousness, and it leaves you to decide what weight to give each. There's also something worth considering about the specificity of Evil Morty's escape. He didn't just blow up the Citadel out of rage, he used its destruction for a specific purpose: to generate the energy needed for the interdimensional breach. The Citadel was destroyed in service of the escape, not as an end in itself. That doesn't make the destruction less harmful, but it does distinguish it from pure nihilistic destruction. There was a purpose to it. The purpose doesn't redeem it, but the presence of purpose, the fact that this was a calculated act in service of a specific goal rather than an expression of uncontrolled violence, is relevant to how you assess it. It's also worth thinking about what the alternative would have looked like. If Evil Morty had chosen not to destroy the Citadel, had chosen to leave it standing, what would the Citadel have done? It would have continued operating, continued producing the same outcomes: the factory labor, the structural inequality, the institutional violence. The Ricks who ran the Citadel before Evil Morty were not, as far as the show depicts, moving toward any kind of meaningful reform. The institution had a momentum of its own, a self-reinforcing logic that produced the same results generation after generation. The choice to leave the Citadel standing is not a harm-free choice. It's a different calculation of harms: the specific, concentrated harm of the destruction versus the ongoing, distributed harm of the institution's continued operation. Evil Morty chose the former, not because he calculated it as the clearly correct moral choice, but because it was the choice that allowed him to escape, and the escape was the goal. Not justice for Mortys, not the improvement of conditions within the accessible multiverse, his own freedom from the system that used him and the universe that was organized around making sure he stayed used. Is that selfish? Yes, probably. The people who died in the Citadel's destruction didn't choose to be the fuel for one Morty's freedom. Their lives had value independent of what their deaths could be used to accomplish. That's a real moral weight, and it doesn't disappear because Evil Morty's grievances were real. But here's the thing that makes the question genuine genuinely hard rather than easy. The show gives us a character who was harmed by a system, who correctly identified that system as unjust, who correctly identified the fundamental structural cause of that injustice in the form of the Central Finite Curve, who correctly concluded that no meaningful change was possible within the system as designed, and who then did something genuinely harmful in order to escape. Every step of his analysis was correct. His conclusion about the system was right. His conclusion about the necessity of escape may well have been right, and the execution of that escape cost lives. At what point does the correctness of an analysis mitigate the moral weight of the execution? How much does being right about the system justify about what you do in response to it? These are not abstract philosophical puzzles. They're questions the show forces you to ask by putting you in the position of having just watched Evil Morty's entire arc, having seen both what he was right about and what he did about it. The show doesn't answer the question.
That's probably the most honest choice it could make. Because the question of whether someone who is correct about injustice is justified in the harm they cause fighting it is not a question with a clean, universal answer. It depends on specifics, on how severe the injustice is, on what alternatives exist, on how great the harm of the response is relative to the ongoing harm of the status quo, on whether the response actually addresses the injustice or merely displaces it. And for Evil Morty, as for every real person who has ever faced an analogous question, the answer sits in the uncomfortable space where valid considerations point in different directions simultaneously. What we can say with real confidence about Evil Morty's story and the question this video is named after is this: he was right that the system was unjust. The evidence for that is overwhelming and has been documented throughout the show with genuine care. The Citadel, the Central Finite Curve, the structural subordination of Mortys, the use of Morty's neurological existence as a resource for Rick's protection, the political system designed to give Morty's participation without power. These things are real within the show's universe. They are harmful, and they were built by choices made by people with power in service of maintaining that power. He was right that the system was not going to reform itself. The Citadel's history, as depicted through Season 3 and the broader context of the show, is not a history of progressive improvement in the conditions of Morty life. It's a history of the same structural outcomes repeating themselves within a framework that was never designed to produce different ones. The system was stable precisely because it was so thoroughly self-reinforcing, so thoroughly embedded in the everyday structures of Citadel life, that meaningful reform from within would have required exactly the kind of disruptive force that the system's own stability was designed to prevent. He was right that escape was possible. He demonstrated this by doing it. The Central Finite Curve, which everyone within the accessible multiverse had presumably accepted as an unchallengeable feature of reality, the way things are, was a construct, a choice, something that could be unmade or bypassed by sufficient intelligence and determination and resources. He had all three, and he used them. He escaped. He proved that escape was possible when no one else had even identified it as a goal. In the way he escaped, the cost of the escape is where the question gets hard and stays hard, because the cost was real, and the people who paid it didn't choose to, and because the benefit of the escape accrued primarily to him, not to the Mortys he spoke for during his election campaign, not to the broader Morty population of the Citadel, not to anyone who remained within the accessible multiverse after he left. So was Evil Morty right? The question keeps splitting itself into layers. Right about the system? Yes. Right about the need to escape? Probably. Right in how he escaped? Harder to say. Maybe impossible to say definitively. But here's the thing that the question might be pointing toward underneath all its components: the existence of the Central Finite Curve, the fact that a specific person at some point made the choice to construct a boundary around a subset of the multiverse to guarantee their own supremacy within it, means that everything happening within that curve is happening inside someone else's choice. Every Rick and every Morty, every adventure, every relationship, every injustice, and every moment of genuine connection, it all takes place inside a structure that was built by and for Rick's ego. That's not a neutral fact, that's a profound fact. It means that the very universe within which all these lives are lived has been shaped at the most fundamental level by the question of what is good for Rick. Evil Morty saw that. He understood it. He found a way out of it, and he took it. Whether what he did to get out was justified, whether the harm he caused along the way is balanced against the fundamental wrong of the system he escaped, is a question that reasonable people thinking carefully about the show will answer differently. The show intends
intends for you to answer it differently from each other. That's not a failure of the narrative, that's the achievement. A story that gives you a villain who is responding to a real injustice, who takes actions that cause real harm, who is both right and wrong simultaneously, and who ultimately escapes into a silence where you can't follow, that's a story that respects its audience's ability to sit with difficulty. The calm way to put it might be this: Evil Morty was right about what he was fighting against. Whether the fight itself was right, whether the specific choices he made in conducting it were choices that can be defended, depends on values that the show presents but doesn't rank for you. That's where you come in. That's where the conversation that the show started needs a human being to finish. The Citadel is destroyed. The curve still exists, presumably, though it's been damaged, and the institution that most directly embodied its logic is gone. Rick is still Rick, still the most powerful being in the accessible multiverse, still operating within the structure that was built to guarantee that fact. The main Morty, the Morty we followed throughout the show, is still there, still navigating his relationship with Rick, still carrying the specific weight of being the Morty in the Rick-Morty dynamic.
And somewhere beyond the yellow portal, there's a Morty who figured out that there was a way out, who paid a terrible price to find it, and who walked through it into a version of reality that was never organized around the question of what Rick needs. Whatever you think of how he got there, that image of that character walking through that portal is one of the most quietly powerful things in the entire show, because it's a character who was defined from the beginning by everything that was done to him, and everything that was done around him, and everything that was maintained at his expense, and who refused, in the end, to let that definition be permanent. He left into the unknown, into the yellow light, into a part of the multiverse where Rick's rules don't apply.
And whatever you make of the ethics of his journey, the fact of his escape, the demonstration that the system could be escaped, that the cage had a door, that the Central Finite Curve was a choice and not a law of nature, is the most radical act any character in the show has ever performed. Whether it was right is yours to decide.